Well, some welcome news in Nigeria's economic sector. The federal government says it has supervised what it describes as a historic agreement to finally resolve the long-running dispute over OPL 245, one of Nigeria's most valuable offshore oil blocks and the subject of decades of legal battles. The resolution happened at a closed-door meeting held in the President's office at the State House. The agreement brings to a close more than 15 years of disputes overall prospecting license 245, paving the way for the development of one of Nigeria's most significant deep water resources. The development comes at a time when Nigeria's broader economy is showing signs of gradual recovery. Yet the outlook remains complicated by high inflation, currency pressures, and the challenge of translating growth into jobs in higher living standards. Moreover, petrol prices in Nigeria have started rising or are under pressure to rise partly because of the escalating crisis in the Middle East. So what do these economic developments tell us about where the country is heading? Well, I'm now joined live from our Lagos studios by the renowned economist and managing director of Financial Derivatives Company Limited, Bismarck Rewane.
Thank you for having me.
All right, let's just go straight to resolving of the dispute of OPL 245. What does this hold for Nigeria particularly, for investment, and for investors in the oil and gas sector?
Every time there's certainty as against uncertainty, it's good for investors and it's good for the system. So as far as I'm concerned, a resolution of OPL dispute, which has been there for many years, is good for business, good for the industry, good for the investors, and good for potential investors who actually at this point in time are uncertain as to what the outcomes will be. So I'm very happy that this has been resolved, and it's coming at the same time when NNPC itself is facing institutional reform, and the president's signing of the Executive Order 9 as to making sure that monies go straight from NNPC to the Federation account, and some amendments. So anything that actually resolves outstanding exogenous factors is good for the business and good for investors and good for the future of Nigerian economy.
Fantastic. You projected that the Nigerian economy would grow by 3.5%, by 2026, pushing the economy, country's GDP to approximately $400 billion. What's the basis for your projection, and how will this impact the general economic indices?
I think that is inaccurate. The GDP today is $250 billion, and if you add 4% to that and add another, even if you make it 8%, you are getting nowhere near $400 billion. $400 billion is almost, God knows, about almost 60% higher. So let's assume, forget about the details as to what the number is, but achieving a 4% growth rate in 2026 is excellent because it's higher than the population growth rate. It also sets the path for the future. And don't forget also, we have to put a caveat. This was a pre-crisis projection. This was before February 28th. This was before the United States and Israel launched an attack on Iran. So everything that was projected before then has to be taken with a caution. Like all economists say, all things being equal. Now things are far from equal. In fact, things are probably more unstable than we predicted initially. So in the Operation Epic Fury and its global impact has something to do with all that we're saying. But that being said, the Nigerian economy was already on a path, what I call a glide path to the Goldilocks economy before this happened. And quite frankly, if you analyze the winners and losers of this impact of the Epic Fury, there are within the Nigerian economy there are winners, and also there are challenges at certain points. But as a non-aligned nation in the geopolitical space, I think that Nigeria is in a good spot at this point in time.
Yeah, we'll talk more about that Middle East. We'll see how we can get it in. But core inflation has been tilting down on a month-on-month basis for some time now. But that does not seem to positively affect the expendable income in the hands of Nigerians, and the cost of living is still high. What's responsible for the disconnect? And how can this be turned around? I mean, the common man on the street is not really interested in these numbers.
Well, the common man may not be interested, but certain things, there's a time lag between when decisions are made, when the transmission effect takes hold, and then the economy begins to feel the impact, and before it trickles down or trickles into the common man's pocket. But what has happened in Nigeria is what we call disinflation. The two things happen. One, we changed the base year. Two, we changed the composition of the basket. So if you are talking about the new methodology inflation and the old methodology inflation, they are two different things. But what we do know is that inflation, which measures the increase in the rate prices relative to the increase in the production of goods, has moved in the right direction. So there's some disinflation. And you can test it by using a synthetic basket. And what was the price of a bag of rice by this time last year? What was it 2 years ago? What was it 3 years ago? So there's a disinflation trend. Why is this a good thing? Is that once inflation goes in a particular direction and falls below a particular level, then growth becomes, you unlock the growth drivers and make that possible for Nigerians to get the benefit. But I think one thing we have to understand, we have to know the difference between disinflation and deflation. In the past year or so, there has been a lot of imports of goods under the scheme of bringing in goods to bring down prices. And so when you import goods and the prices come down, it could force a situation where the guys who are producing these goods, the landed cost of these products is lower than the production cost. And therefore, the importers get the benefit of the lower price while the local producers do not get that benefit. So I think that is important to understand. But generally speaking, so that people can understand what you're saying, that the price of goods has declined, but it's a basket. In that basket, there are some goods that the price have increased, and so in that basket, there are some price of goods that have actually declined. And the best way to illustrate this was in the inflation numbers that came out for January, showed something which was quite distinct. One was that the state with the lowest food inflation was Ebonyi State, where it was 1.8%, and the state with the highest rate of inflation was Kogi State, where it was about almost 19%. Why is it that food inflation in Kogi State will be 19% and food inflation in Ebonyi State will be 1.8%? Simply put, security, and there was a security situation which affected the breadbasket of Nigeria, which is Kogi, Kwara, Nasarawa, and all. So with insecurity, the products, they were stranded and couldn't get to the market. And therefore, you saw, and people couldn't produce, people couldn't work, and we saw high inflation there. While a state like Ebonyi State, which produces yams and other things, had excess activity, excess production, and the prices dropped sharply. It is not good for one part of the country to have 1.8 or 2% inflation, and another part of the country to have 20% inflation and 19% inflation. So there's going to be moving towards equilibrium. But generally speaking, I can tell you, sir, that prices are trending downward before this crisis of epic fury, and that seasonal factors, there's harvest season. There's also the other factors like the price of petrol, which declined before this crisis, and there are other things like the naira appreciating in value. So generally speaking, yes, it is true that the data is encouraging, but the impact is not being felt, and it will still take some time before the impact is felt. I think I want to get that very clearly, put that on the table.
Yeah, because the impact really, just like you're talking, is what will matter to Nigerians, particularly with the expendable income in their pocket and the rise of maybe the petrol and stuff like that. On overall economic performance, you forecast that Nigeria's GDP growth will rise to 4.1 in 2026. At the same time, you have identified four major risks that could upset these projections. Talk about these four major risks and what needs to be done to either avert or ameliorate these risks.
Again, let me intervene and tell you that the projections that were made before Epic Fury, right? And what we did say was that if the price of oil falls sharply and the naira weakens, inflation will come under severe pressure. In fact, it will reverse itself to get to a point of inflection. We also felt that if the production of oil in Nigeria drops below a particular level to affect, we also said that if the power supply situation deteriorates and there's a reduction in output, this could affect the level of price inflation. And we also felt that in our projections that if for any reason there's civil unrest, even in the Niger Delta, in the middle belt of Nigeria, it could affect production. So, but those are, one is the scenario where growth is undisturbed and it goes according to projection. The other is when it is disrupted. And the third was, which is now the impact of these exogenous shocks on the Nigerian economy and the global economy. What happens? So I think you have to take it in that context. But generally speaking, I want to point out something that when we talked about inflation, two things that are not in the inflation equation or inflation consideration at this point. There's the Ramadan fasting season, which has changed the projection of especially fruits and many other things which are Ramadan sensitive. Then we have the Easter coming up on 4th and 5th of April. So we have an extended period of religious activity and fasting, Lent, and all of that. That affects. And then after that, having said that, we then go into a huge political season of primaries in April, that is next month, at the end of next month, and so on. So 2026, as projected as a normal year, is one thing. 2026, in the heat of political activity, in the heat of insecurity, and more than anything else, the heat of exogenous shocks as depicted by the attack of the United States and Israel on Iran, that's another factor. So one has to take those projections that were made before the shock and the projections that are being made now, and we are going to have to discuss that. Is it going to be a short period of violence, or is it going to be an extended period of violence, or is it going to be much longer than we ever predicted, and what are the implications of that? And you can see from the slides there that GDP at 4.07, inflation at 15%, and the exchange rate official today is at 13.98, and the exchange rate in the parallel market is at 14.20. Money supply growth at 10.37. All of this show signs that the economy was heading towards what we call a Goldilocks economy, where you have stable exchange rate, low unemployment, improved growth, and low inflation. That was where we were before the crisis jumped upon us directly.
Yeah, still following from your line of reasoning or your thoughts on before, now, and whenever it ends, you projected that the Nigerian exchange's total market capitalization could jump to 262 trillion in 2026, the year we're in, up from 93 trillion. But in some quarters, the argument has been about what the exchange rate was before this administration and what it is now. So it's still tacky. What do you think?
No, I think let's be very clear. What we said that the market capitalization on the Nigerian Stock Exchange has little or nothing to do with the exchange rate of the naira. Let's be clear. It means that the value of the shares listed on the Nigerian Stock Exchange, which today is actually 125 trillion naira, would almost double to about 240 trillion because of three things. One, the listing of the Dangote refinery, which by whichever exchange rate you use, was about $23 to $25 billion. And the market valuation is not just what was invested, but is as an ongoing concern. So that gives you at least another maybe 45 or 50 trillion naira added to the 120, so you're already at 160. The listing of NNPC, on the other hand, as well, is expected to add another maybe 20 trillion naira to the Nigerian stock exchange market capitalization. Then let us look at the earnings. So, for example, MTN has reported almost a 53% or so higher earnings, higher return. Their turnover and their profitability are about 1.5 trillion. They've acquired IHS fully, and all of that means that it becomes almost a fully integrated telco provider in voice, in fintech, in streaming, and all of that. So, what is going to happen to that stock, which opened about a year ago at 184 and today is at 700? Take a look at, say, Dangote Cement. Take a look at Bua. Take a look at Okomo Oil. So, if you take the earnings of these companies whose growth rate is higher than the GDP growth rate, which earnings are higher and faster than the earnings are faster and higher than those of the sector. So, quite frankly, we believe that that's a good picture, and it's an objective analysis that shows that it's real, it's realistic, it's not an optimistic picture.
Let's discuss monetary policy. On monetary policy, you emphasize that 2026 will likely mark the beginning of cautious interest rate cuts by the CBN. However, you want that the apex band will move slowly and conditionally. Why the warning?
Yes. No, why I say this is that the apex bank, that is the Central Bank of Nigeria, has proven clearly and objectively that they are autonomous, they are independent, they are also driven by market forces and national interest. So, of all the institutions in the country that are charged with reform, we think the Central Bank stands out as being able to, one, keep the currency stable, keep inflation well managed, keep the soundness and safeness of the safety of the financial system and the banking system. The recapitalization is almost complete and successful. So rather than just go with the euphoria of other markets, I think the Central Bank of Nigeria in managing monetary policy can stand out that it has been independent and driven basically by the fundamentals. Having said that, the Central Bank of Nigeria does not work in isolation. They work, one, in conjunction and in conjunction with the fiscal authorities. One, the Federal Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of the Budget, the Ministry of Investment, tax authorities, and all of that. So while on one hand, the fiscal authorities are pursuing a growth agenda, the Central Bank of Nigeria is focused primarily on price stability and also to ensure that the economy doesn't go into an overheated mode. I think that's very clear as far as we can. So the question, again, these projections were made before Epic Fury. So I want you to be very clear as to the pre-crisis projections and the current crisis projection, and then what the post-crisis projection will be. And I think that is more important. All the projections that were made before February 28 are now on hold. What has happened in the last 7 days is one thing which we will analyze. And what also we are going to have to look at is what happens as we go forward, especially if this becomes a crisis that is going to last more than 12 weeks or 20 weeks. Remember that when Russia went into Ukraine, everybody, even the most pessimistic economists and geopolitical analysts said that, look, gentlemen, this is going to be 1 week, this is going to be 5 days, this is going to be 1 month, it's going to be 2 months. Guess what? That is 5 years ago. We are in the 5th year, and Ukraine and Russia are still throwing missiles or firing missiles at one another. There has been no peace in that place. So if your projections were that, okay, this thing will last maximum of 6 months, you are almost 4 years late in your projection. So I want us to be very clear that to start a crisis is something, but to see it through, we don't know where it will end. And that is why I would draw the attention of viewers to a statement made by Zebedee Brzezinski, who was the National Security Advisor under Jimmy Carter. And now this was in 2004. And Brzezinski, God bless his soul, said that America's contradictory global roles could lead to either, and I'm quoting here, could lead to either a new global community or global chaos, noting that relying on dominance rather than leadership could trigger widespread hostility. He argued that unilateral action risks isolation of the U.S. amid massive political unrest, stressing that failure in the Middle East means a chaotic and dangerous world. Those were the words of Zebedee Brzezinski. In most wars, long or short, there are no victors, and quite frankly, almost everybody is vanquished.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's like a prophetic statement made by him then. Thank you so much, Managing Director.
In 2004.
Yeah, of Financial Derivatives Company Limited, Bismarck Rewane. And thank you for explaining the before, on, and after. Thank you so much for your time on Prime Time.